Welcome back, everybody. I don't know about you, but these last few weeks after the election have been, well, a little rough. It's November 17th, 2024. And yeah, this election kind of brought out a lot of strong feelings from everybody. I've even been feeling some tension with my best friend, actually. We have totally different political views, and let's just say we're both kind of dreading Thanksgiving dinner at this point. And I know I'm not alone in this, right? A lot of you listening are probably dealing with, I don't know, maybe some strained relationships right now, maybe even some hurt feelings because of all these political disagreements. So, with this deep dive, we're not going to pick sides or anything. We're not going to rehash every single moment of the campaigns. Instead, we're going to try and figure out how to, rebuild those connections that are feeling a little strained right now. We've got a really interesting stack of sources to help us with this. We've got books on dark psychology, some political science articles about democracy. We even have a book on lying. And we're going to look at how all these different fields can shed some light on.
Why these political disagreements can feel so personal, and then we're going to try and come up with some strategies to bridge those divides.
It's really interesting because this whole feeling of division, this isn't new. Societies all throughout history have had to deal with this kind of thing. And I think looking at those parallels, those historical parallels, can actually give us some good insight into how we might be able to navigate the challenges that we're facing today.
Yeah. Like that saying goes, those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it, or
Yeah.
something like that. But we're not going to focus on the doom and gloom, right? We're going to use those historical echoes to, I guess, to empower ourselves to try and understand the patterns and hopefully figure out ways to break the cycle of division. So first, let's dive into what our sources are calling the dark side of politics. Now, when we hear dark psychology, we tend to think of, I don't know, like villains in movies, the manipulative masterminds. But it's important to remember that these tactics that they use, they can show up in everyday life, especially when people are feeling stressed or desperate to reach a goal, like, say, winning an election.
Right, exactly. The sources that we're looking at point out that these tactics, while they're usually associated with bad intentions or malicious intent, they can also pop up in more subtle ways when people are feeling stressed out or when people feel like they really, really need to achieve something.
Okay, so we're not saying that all politicians are evil masterminds using some kind of mind control, but it is helpful to understand what tactics they might be using so we can be more aware and protect ourselves, right? It's kind of like learning self-defense, but for your mind. One tactic that really stood out to me was gaslighting. It's basically when somebody denies another person's reality, and they do it to make the other person question their own sanity.
Yeah, and it's a really sneaky form of manipulation.
Yeah.
Because it makes the victim doubt themselves, and then that can make them more vulnerable to being manipulated even more in the future.
So like imagine a politician who denies making a statement, even though there's like clear video evidence of them making that statement. That can make their supporters start to doubt their own memory, and then they become even more reliant on that politician to tell them what's true.
And that reliance on just one source of information, especially when it's reinforced by things like algorithms and echo chambers online, that can make the feeling of division even worse and make it harder to have a real conversation with people who have different points of view.
Yeah, it's almost like we're being trained to not trust ourselves.
Yeah.
To not trust what we see and what we hear, and instead just rely on certain authorities, which can be really dangerous, not just in politics, but in any relationship, really, especially when you think about how important trust and open communication are. Another tactic that our sources talk about is mirroring. Have you ever noticed how some politicians will kind of subtly copy the mannerisms or the language of whoever they're talking to?
Yeah, it's a way to create this instant sense of connection and trust. When politicians can make themselves seem similar to their audience, they can kind of bypass that critical thinking and get to people on a more emotional level.
Yeah, and it's kind of freaky when you think about how easily we can be influenced by those really subtle cues. It's a good reminder to really pay attention to our gut feelings and not just automatically trust someone just because they seem to get us. Then there's this idea of preying on vulnerability. This is where manipulators go after people who are feeling insecure, anxious, or just desperate to belong.
Right, and usually that involves exploiting people's fears and offering simple solutions to problems that are actually really complicated. It's a way to make people dependent on the manipulator, who then gets to act like they're the only one who can give them the answers.
It's like that old saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. And unfortunately, political campaigns will often take advantage of times when things are uncertain, when people are afraid, to push their own agendas and strengthen their base, even if it means making those divisions in society even deeper. Now, before we all get super cynical and depressed, remember, being aware of these tactics is powerful, By understanding these tactics, we can start to see them when they're happening and protect ourselves from being manipulated, not just in politics, but in our personal lives too. It's about being a more careful listener and thinking more critically, not just accepting everything we hear at face value, but questioning things, analyzing them, and looking for different points of view. So with all this talk about dark psychology and manipulation, you might be feeling a little, well, disillusioned with politics right now. But here's the good news. We can learn from history. People have been divided before, and we've found ways to overcome it. One example that our sources bring up is South Africa and how they transitioned out of apartheid. It was a long and complicated process for sure, full of challenges and setbacks. But it's a powerful story of how a society can heal and move towards reconciliation.
What's interesting about that example is the role that institutions played. Things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They gave victims a platform to share their stories.
Yeah.
And gave perpetrators a chance to admit what they had done. And it was a way for the whole nation to begin to heal together.
Right, and it wasn't about just erasing the past or pretending that all those injustices never happened. It was about acknowledging the pain, holding people accountable, and working together to build a future based on truth and understanding.
And even though the South African example is unique in a lot of ways, I think it has some really valuable lessons for us about how important dialogue is, and empathy, and a commitment to building a society that's more just and equal.
It shows us that even when there's huge division, even historical trauma, change is possible. It takes courage and compassion, and a willingness to face some difficult truths. But it's a reminder that we have the power to choose a different path, a path towards healing in unity. So we've talked about the dark side of politics. We've found some hope in these stories of reconciliation from history. But now we need to look inward. How do our own tendencies to be dishonest, even in small ways, contribute to this breakdown of trust and communication in our relationships? One of our sources, a book called Surrounded by Liars, really digs into the psychology of lying. And it argues that, we all lie sometimes, but the reasons why we lie and how we lie can tell us a lot about our personalities and how we communicate.
Yeah, the book talks about this idea of color personalities, and it says that each type has a different lying style. It's not about saying some people are good liars and some are bad. It's more about trying to understand what motivates us to lie and what patterns we fall into.
So, for example, you have the red personality type. They're all about control and authority. They might tell these big lies to stay in charge and get things done.
Yeah.
They might not even think of it as lying, really, more like strategizing or bending the truth to get what they want.
Then you have the green personality, who's all about keeping the peace and avoiding conflict. So they might tell white lies to avoid hurting other people's feelings, to smooth things over or downplay their own needs, just to keep things harmonious.
So it's not as simple as saying lying is bad, right? Our reasons for lying can be really complicated. And sometimes those white lies, well, they're told with good intentions. But understanding these different lying styles can really change the game when it comes to handling conflict and building more honest relationships. Think about it. If you know that your partner, for example, tends to tell little white lies just to avoid a fight, you might not take it so personally when they're being evasive. You can have that conversation with more empathy and create a space where they feel safe enough to tell you how they really feel.
It's about realizing that not everybody communicates the same way, and not everyone is comfortable with being totally honest. And once we understand those differences, we can avoid a lot of misunderstandings and build stronger connections.
So here's a question for you all to think about. What's your lying style? Are you a big truth bender? Someone who smooths things over with white lies? Or somewhere in between? Don't worry, we're not judging. This is about knowing yourself and seeing how those tendencies might be affecting your relationships. Especially after an election like this, where being honest and understanding is so important. We've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. We talked about the dark side of politics, found some inspiration and stories of reconciliation from history, and even started looking at our own tendencies to be dishonest. But we're not done yet. Welcome back to our deep dive on rebuilding relationships after this crazy election. We've already uncovered some pretty interesting insights into the psychology of, political manipulation and our own little tendencies to fudge the truth sometimes. But now let's take a trip back in time, shall we? And see what lessons we can learn from societies that have gone through similar things. Earlier, we talked a little bit about South Africa's transition out of apartheid. But our sources also highlight another interesting historical parallel: the development of the welfare state in Europe.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating example because It shows how policies that are meant to do good, policies designed to create a more just and fair society, can actually end up creating some unexpected tension and conflict.
So help me connect the dots here. How does the whole welfare state thing relate to what we're going through now?
Yeah.
With all the division and political arguments.
Well, as our sources explain, when welfare systems were being put in place in Europe, it was meant to improve social well-being for everybody. But it ended up causing friction between different groups. Like, for example, you had labor unions and governments clashing over things like wage moderation and how much money should be spent on social policies.
So even though everyone wanted to make things better, there were disagreements about how to do it. And those disagreements caused conflict.
Exactly. And those tensions really highlight something important, even when we share the same values, like wanting social justice or economic fairness. We might have very different ideas about how to actually achieve those things.
That makes sense. It's like we might all agree that education is important, but we might have totally different ideas about what makes a good education, how it should be funded, who should have access to it. And all those differences can become these flashpoints for conflict, especially when everything's already so politically charged.
Exactly. And this whole historical example with the welfare state reminds us that these kinds of tensions aren't new. They've been woven into the fabric of society and politics for centuries. The key is to remember that these disagreements, they often come from deeply held values and beliefs, and to approach those conversations with empathy and respect, even when we don't see eye to eye.
Yeah, it's about understanding that everyone comes to these issues with different experiences, different priorities. And that's okay. We don't have to agree on every single thing to have a good conversation, a respectful conversation. So we explored these historical parallels, South Africa moving on from apartheid, the development of the welfare state in Europe. Both show how complex social and political change can be, and how even when people are trying to make things better, there can be conflict. But they also give us hope. They remind us that even societies that are deeply divided can find ways to heal and move forward together. Now let's bring it back to the personal level. How can we use what we've learned from history and psychology to start rebuilding those relationships that have been strained by this election? Because let's be real, a lot of us are feeling the weight of these political disagreements in our families, with our friends, even at work.
That's where the real challenge begins. But the good news is our sources offer a bunch of practical strategies for bridging the divide and rebuilding trust, even when those differences in opinion feel really big.
Okay, so let's get practical. What are some actual steps we can take to start mending those broken fences? I know I could use some tips on how to have those tough conversations with my best friend without things turning to a shouting match.
Well, one of the most important things we can do is to really listen to each other, to practice active listening. I know it sounds simple, but it can be a lot harder than we think. Active listening means really hearing what the other person is saying and trying to understand their point of view, even if you don't agree with them.
So it's about putting aside our own judgments and assumptions and genuinely trying to see the world from their perspective, asking questions, reflecting back what we hear, and acknowledging their feelings, even if we don't share their views.
Yeah, and sometimes active listening means just being there with the person, giving them space to express their emotions without interrupting, without trying to fix things. It's about creating an environment where they feel safe and respected.
I think that's so important, especially now. After an election that felt so divisive, it's easy to get caught up in being right. But taking the time to really listen to someone else can be a huge step towards rebuilding trust and understanding.
And once you've built that foundation of listening, it's important to focus on finding common ground. Remember, even with all the political disagreements, there are probably some shared values or goals that you can connect on. It might take some effort to look past the surface level differences, but those shared values can be really powerful bridges.
Absolutely. Like maybe you and your uncle have completely different views on healthcare, but maybe you both really value family and community. Focusing on their shared values can help soften those disagreements and remind you that you're not as far apart as you might think.
And when you do find that common ground, acknowledge it. Tell the other person that you appreciate their values and point out those areas where you agree. It can create a sense of connection and remind you that you're on the same team, even if you don't agree on every single issue.
It's about shifting from us versus them to we. And that shift in perspective can be really powerful, especially when we're feeling overwhelmed by all this division and conflict. Okay, so we've got active listening, finding common ground. What else can we do to navigate these tough conversations and start rebuilding?
Well, it might seem obvious, but honest and respectful communication is key. It's about being clear and direct about your own beliefs and opinions, but without attacking the other person or blaming them.
Right. It's about remembering that the person you're talking to is more than just their political views. They're your friend, your family member, someone you care about. And even if you disagree with their political choices, it's important to treat them with respect.
And one way to do that is to use I statements. Instead of saying, "You're wrong about this," try saying, "I see things differently because, ah." It takes the focus off of attacking the other person and lets you share your own perspective in a way that's more constructive.
That's a great tip. It's about owning our own feelings and beliefs instead of putting them onto other people. And it creates a space where people are more open to having a dialogue. But sometimes, even with the best intentions, things can get heated. So what do we do when the conversation starts to go off the rails?
That's where boundaries come in. It's totally okay and often necessary to set some limits on how you talk about politics. Maybe you agree to avoid certain topics that are really triggering, or you set a time limit for those conversations.
It's like saying, I'm willing to talk about this, but I need to do it in a way that feels safe and respectful for both of us. And it's totally fine to take a break or change the subject if things start to get too intense.
Right, and setting boundaries isn't about avoiding tough conversations altogether. It's about creating a framework for those conversations that allows for honesty and respect.
It's about protecting yourself and the relationship from unnecessary conflict so that those conversations can happen in a way that's healthy and productive. Okay, so we've talked about active listening, finding common ground, honest and respectful communication, and setting boundaries. These are really powerful tools for rebuilding trust and connection, not just after an election, but any time different views have caused tension.
But there's one more thing I want to emphasize. Don't let politics define your whole relationship with someone.
That's such a good point. It's easy to get so caught up in the debates and the arguments that we forget about the person behind those views. They're still your friend, your family member, someone you care about. And those relationships are worth saving, even if you don't agree on every political issue. So as we head into the final part of our deep dive, I want you to think about those relationships that have been strained by this election. What steps can you take using these strategies we've talked about? Active listening, finding common ground, honest communication, setting boundaries. What can you do to start rebuilding those connections? It might not be easy, but the rewards of bridging those divides, of reclaiming those relationships, are huge. So stay tuned as we explore how technology and this whole evolving media landscape affects our ability to connect and empathize in a world where different viewpoints are just a click away. All right, welcome back to our deep dive. We've been talking about the dark side of politics, learned a bit from history, and even explored some ways to mend those relationships that have been, well, kind of strained by political differences. But now I want to talk about something that's been in the background this whole time: technology. How does technology, especially the way we get our news and information online, affect our ability to connect with people who see things differently?
It's a big question and a tricky one. One of our sources, this book called Everything is Frecked, argues that technology is changing so fast that it's almost letting us create our own little realities online. Like, we can choose to only see news and opinions that we already agree with, right? So we end up in these echo chambers where we never really hear anything that challenges our views.
It's like we're all living in our own filter bubbles. We pick our news sources, our social media feeds, even the online groups we join, based on shared political views a lot of the time. It's comfortable, sure, but does it make it harder to actually encounter those different perspectives? The kind that make us think and help us understand the world a little better.
It definitely can. And the algorithms that run these platforms, they're getting smarter all the time.
Yeah.
They're getting better at figuring out what we want to see, and then they feed us more of it. So it's easy to get stuck in this loop where we're constantly being told we're right, which makes it even harder to break out and, actually talk to people who think differently.
So technology is kind of making those natural human tendencies worse, right? Like, we're already inclined to seek out people who are like us and avoid conflict. But sometimes those tough conversations, those moments where we have to really face a different point of view, those are the moments where we grow the most.
Absolutely. It's when we get uncomfortable, when our ideas are challenged, when our perspectives are broadened. That's when we really learn and evolve. But if we're always protecting ourselves from opposing viewpoints, then we risk becoming, intellectually stuck and less able to empathize with people who see things differently.
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Technology has given us these amazing tools for connecting with people all over the world, for finding information, for having real discussions. But it's also made it way easier to isolate ourselves, to stay in these little ideological bubbles where everything we see just confirms what we already believe. So what can we do about it? How can we use technology to actually connect and understand each other better instead of just making the division worse?
I think awareness is a good place to start. Just realizing that these algorithms exist, that they're designed to keep us clicking and scrolling by showing us stuff that we already agree with, that's a
Yeah.
big first step. Once we understand that, then we can start to make different choices about how we use technology.
So instead of just passively scrolling through our feeds, we can make an effort to look for different perspectives,
Hmm.
right? We can follow people and organizations that challenge our views. We can engage in respectful debates online, even if it makes us a little uncomfortable.
Exactly. And we can be more thoughtful about where we get our information. Just because something pops up on our feed doesn't mean it's true or unbiased. We got to be critical, think about the source, do our own research before we just accept something as fact.
We need to be active participants, not just passive consumers. Cultivate a healthy sense of skepticism, question everything, and be open to the idea that we might be wrong sometimes.
And all of that, the critical thinking, the empathy, the communication skills, those are valuable everywhere, not just online. They're essential for any kind of relationship, especially when we're trying to rebuild after something like a divisive election.
So true. All those strategies we talked about earlier, the listening, finding common ground, honest and respectful communication, setting boundaries, those are more important than ever. In a world where it's so easy to just retreat into our echo chambers and, well, demonize anyone who disagrees with us. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I hope you're leaving with a sense of, I don't know, hope and maybe even a little bit of empowerment. We dug into some tough stuff like political manipulation, lying, and the challenges of technology, but we also found some valuable tools for building stronger relationships, even when politics makes things feel impossible. Those connections with our families, our friends, our communities, those are what make life meaningful. They're worth fighting for, worth nurturing, and definitely worth the effort of bridging those divides, even when it's hard. So go out there, use what we've talked about, and be the change you want to see. Have those hard conversations, practice empathy, look for that common ground, and remember, we're all in this together, even if we don't always agree on how to get there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll be back soon with more fascinating stuff to explore. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep connecting with each other.
Maybe, just maybe, if we all put in a little effort and a whole lot of empathy, we can build a world where understanding and connection are stronger than division and distrust.